Behind the shadows of Andrew Schulz's massive success story in 2023 lies a scary truth. Schulz has struggled to cope with his newfound fame, exposed with his terrible mistreatment of guests on the massively successful Flagrant podcast.
You came from this place, you're coming from North Korea, where you don't have food easily accessible to you, and then you get to America where you can eat whatever you want.
Which has become less of a comedy show and more of a battleground where guests are subject to his narcissistic tendencies, condescending attitudes, personal attacks, and being plain out disrespectful. From cutting off guests mid-sentence to belittling their opinions, the show has lost any entertainment value and has become a group of unfunny comedians overly laughing at jokes that just aren't that good, and lost in the pursuit of looking for the next viral clip instead of allowing the conversation to just flow naturally. And looking into Flagrant's most recent episodes, things are about to get a lot worse. To understand what's happening here, we need to understand the dynamic of the show. Andrew is the main character who leads the majority of the jokes and the lines of questioning. Akash, who sat right next to Andrew, is also a comedian, but takes on the role of Schulz's sidekick, agreeing with everything he says and overly laughing at jokes that just aren't that funny, which comes across as super cringe and hard to watch. Mark is also a comedian and is very similar to Akash in that for the most part, he agrees with everything Schulz says no matter how ridiculous and rarely adds anything unique to the conversation. And then we have Alex, who's sort of an odd one out. He's a lot less vocal to the rest of the cast and has been seen offering quite a bit of resistance to Schulz's ridiculous statements, acting as the voice of reason for the show. He is super underrated. The unique dynamic he adds breaks up the yes man energy and is likely the reason the show is so successful.
You're not gonna laugh when
special.
you just hear him talk.
He's already happy. He's already established.
On November of 2022, Schulz would be invited onto the Full Send podcast, and for the first time ever, he would be the guest. The show was hosted by Steiny, Steve Will Do It, and Kyle. Kyle being the main host and the leader of the Nelk Boys, Steve hopping on as a temporary host, and Steiny being the self-deprecative black sheep of the team who people tend to pick on for comedic relief. Something Schulz would exploit later on in the episode. A conflict between Schulz and Steiny would arise when Steiny would briefly glance down at his phone to review notes for the episode to ask Schulz a new question. Andrew would then call them out for their lack of preparation and professionalism and begin to playfully pick on Steiny.
Well, if I'm looking at my notes, I have some things personally that I wrote that I wanted to ask you. Not on there.
Okay.
So I can't look at that and then ask you that?
The conflict would worsen to unprecedented levels, however, when Schulz would turn it up a notch and start launching personal attacks at Steiny, calling him annoying.
I thought you were just being a little annoying.
Andrew would claim he feels like he's forcing the Nelk Boys to do the podcast and that he did them a favor by taking the time out of his day to be there. Schulz's glaring self-deluded ego didn't let him realize that the Full Send podcast is one of the biggest in the world, much bigger than Flagrant, and if anything, the Nelk group were giving him a platform. Following this, Schulz would pretend to have Steiny all figured out and turn the whole episode into a therapy session, acting like he's a licensed professional, calling him insecure.
Are you, I don't know if you're playing a character or you're having like an insecure moment. If you're having a vulnerable, insecure moment, then I want to talk about it.
The episode went so poorly that Schulz would tell the Nelk Boys not to upload the episode after being the reason it didn't go well.
After the podcast, Schulz just kind of approached me and John and said, like, I don't know if that was really it. Like, I feel like if I want to be on the pod, like, we could do something way bigger and some shit that's like really gonna break the internet.
Yeah.
Until one day spontaneously drops an episode on his own podcast, yelling at the camera, telling the Nelk Boys to go ahead and upload the podcast, but when he felt like it.
Nelk, release the pod.
Andrew's mistreatment of the members of Nelk may have been bad, but nothing could prepare you for how he would act when he was the host on Flagrant. Unfortunately for Andrew, in this case, he would get a taste of his own medicine when the guest fired back with a vicious, deep-cutting insult of her own and would make Schulz regret everything. In April of 2023, Whitney Cummings would make a much-anticipated appearance on the Flagrant podcast. Similar to Andrew, Whitney is also a comedian, but is known to be unfunny, awkward, and cringe, and her style of comedy being overly sexual. The episode began with high energy and positive vibes, but took a sudden turn for the worse when Andrew started to call Whitney out for the way she looked, telling her she looked like a dog, and then proceeded to make fun of her facial expressions. This was brushed under the rug as comedians being comedians, just joking around, but then Schulz would begin to repeatedly cut Whitney off, making it virtually impossible for her to make a point. And when Whitney wanted to add on to something Schulz just said, she was stopped in her tracks and was obviously shocked based on her reaction. At this point, a confused Whitney addresses Schulz's aggressive behavior, accusing him of wanting to fight with her, but this would ultimately make no difference. Shortly after, Andrew started to twist her words and pick on every little thing she said, and Whitney was visibly becoming frustrated. But at some point, enough was enough, and Whitney decided to fire back with her own insult, except hers cut a little deeper than Andrew's. She would make a joke about Andrew's fertility, as him and his wife were struggling to have a child for quite some time now. After Whitney made this joke, there was a visible difference in Schulz's vibe for the rest of the podcast, and his high energy, erratic, senseless attitude quickly evaporated. And despite Whitney not being too popular herself, the comment section was super one-sided. Never thought I'd say this, but you guys need to let Whitney Cummings talk. Andrew somehow managed to not make Whitney the most obnoxious person in the room. Despite Andrew's antics, his brand in Flagrant continued to grow every single day, but it's only a matter of time until his sins catch up to him. To learn more about these 7 deadly sins of YouTubers, click right here. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.